many shifts would it take you to afford shoes like mine? Billionaire Victoria Mercer asked, drawing nervous laughter from her guests. All evening she had mocked Damon Price, a black single father working as a waiter, for his uniform, his age, and the way he spoke with too much confidence for someone in his position. But when Victoria asked whether his 10-year-old daughter felt ashamed of him, Damon slowly set down the wine bottle. "Mock me again, I dare you." Victoria smiled until Damon quietly named the 3 hidden flaws her billion-dollar platform had spent 3 months trying to bury. Within seconds, the most powerful woman in the room had nothing left to say. If a story like this keeps you hooked, go ahead and hit subscribe now, because what happens between Damon and Victoria only gets more intense from here. Astor House smelled like candle wax and expensive perfume, and Damon Price had learned to move through that smell without letting him remind him of anything. He carried a bottle of red wine toward table 9 with the same steady rhythm he brought to every table, the same rhythm that had gotten him voted best waiter on staff 3 years running by the only person's opinion that mattered inside these walls, his manager, Reuben Hayes. Reuben liked to say that Damon remembered names the way other men remembered scores, and that he could talk a nervous vineyard question into a confident answer without ever making a guest feel small for asking it. The other servers at Astor House often asked Damon how he stayed so unbothered on the busiest nights when tempers ran short and tips ran thin, and he never had a complicated answer for them. He told them the work itself demanded nothing more than attention and patience, 2 things he'd learned to give freely once he stopped measuring his worth by what other people assumed about the uniform he wore. What none of the diners at Table 9 knew, and what Damon rarely let himself think about during a shift, was that the man refilling their glasses had once built the kind of software that made billion-dollar companies run. 7 years earlier, Damon was the lead engineer and co-founder of Crestline Systems, the architect behind a supply chain forecasting platform so advanced that competitors spent years trying to reverse engineer it. He had designed the core structure himself, the part that let the whole system bend instead of break when markets shifted without warning. Then his daughter Mila, 3 years old at the time, had been diagnosed with a heart defect that required emergency surgery the family's insurance would only partially cover. Damon sold his equity and control of Crestline for a fraction of what it was worth, signing the papers in a hospital conference room while his wife Renee held his hand and a surgeon waited 2 floors up. He never regretted it. Mila lived, grew, learned to ride a bike, and eventually turned 10 years old in the small Brooklyn apartment Damon now called home. 3 years ago, Renee lost a long fight with illness of her own, and since then, Damon had been raising his daughter alone, choosing a steady paycheck and predictable nights over any return to the industry that once bore his name. Victoria Mercer walked into Astor House that evening with the practiced ease of someone who had never once worried about being seated. She was 42 years old, the chief executive and largest shareholder of Mercer Axis, and the kind of leader business magazines love to photograph beside words like visionary and disruptor. She arrived with her chief of staff, Helena Marlowe, and a small group of advisors, all of them there to finalize details for the upcoming launch of a platform called Horizon. Victoria had genuinely built Mercer Axis from a regional player to a global name, and she believed with total sincerity that this achievement gave her the right to define the people around her however she saw fit. That belief had calcified over years of boardrooms where nobody dared correct her, years of headlines calling her fearless and uncompromising, until the line between kindness and cruelty had blurred so completely in her own mind that she no longer noticed when she crossed it. She had convinced herself somewhere along the way that kindness to strangers was a luxury reserved for people who hadn't earned the right to demand more from the world around them. She decided within the first minute that Damon was beneath her notice, and she never once used his name, even after he introduced himself. She called him waiter, the way another person might call a chair,
and when he offered a recommendation from the wine list, she cut him off and asked him to recite 3 vintages the restaurant did not carry. Watching his face for the stumble she expected, it never came. Damon answered calmly, correctly, and without a trace of defensiveness. And something about that composure seemed to irritate Victoria more than any mistake would have. "You speak awfully well for someone doing this job," she said, loud enough for the table to hear. And a few of her advisors exchanged a glance that suggested they understood exactly what she meant, even if none of them said so. Helena Marlowe felt the comment land wrong, but stayed quiet, unwilling to disrupt a dinner that was supposed to end in a signed agreement between Mercer Axis and the restaurant's parent hospitality group. When Damon's eyes drifted briefly toward a tablet propped open near Victoria's elbow, she pulled it toward herself before he could see anything more than a flicker of a diagram. "Don't worry about that," she told him, not looking up. "That's not something you need to understand. Just make sure my glass doesn't sit empty." A few guests laughed, the kind of laugh people give when they're relieved the comment wasn't aimed at them. Victoria kept going because Damon's calm refused to give her the reaction she was hunting. She asked how many shifts a man his age would need to work to afford shoes like hers, and she said she had met people like him before, people who spent a few evenings in a nice room and started imagining they belonged there.
She told him a man closing in on 40 should be grateful just to be allowed inside a place like Astor House at all. Damon refilled her water glass without a word, his jaw tight, his hands perfectly steady. Then Victoria asked whether his daughter was proud of him or whether the girl avoided mentioning to her friends that her father was a waiter. She asked almost gently whether he was teaching his child that the world owed his family something. That question did what the others hadn't. Damon set the wine bottle down on the table slowly, deliberately, the sound of glass meeting linen, the only thing that broke the silence at table 9. "Mock me again," he said, his eyes steady on hers. "I dare you." Victoria smiled, the expression of someone who believed she had finally provoked a reaction she could use against him. "Let's not turn your unprofessionalism into a conversation about prejudice," she said. "I treat every member of staff exactly the same." "No," Damon answered, his voice even. "You treat everyone badly. You just choose certain people to look down on more than others." The table went completely silent, forks resting untouched against china, until one of the advisors cleared his throat and reached for the tablet, angling it slightly to show Victoria something on the screen. The motion turned his device just enough that Damon, standing a step behind her shoulder, caught a clear look at the architecture diagram glowing there, a schematic labeled Horizon spread across the display in blue and white lines. He said nothing. He finished pouring water at the neighboring table first, unhurried, giving himself the time to look again without appearing to look at all. What caught him wasn't the branding or the polished interface layered over the top. It was a single internal module name buried in the diagram's corner, a term he recognized immediately because he was the person who had coined it 7 years earlier, back when Crestline's forecasting engine was still just lines of code on his own laptop. He circled the table once more, refilling glasses, and let his gaze fall on the diagram a second time, longer now, confirming what he'd seen. The way the data layers were stacked matched a structure he had designed by hand. A particular variable sat exactly where he had placed it, doing exactly the job he had built it to do. This was not a coincidence, and it was not a resemblance. This was his work, sitting inside a presentation for a product Victoria Mercer was about to introduce to the world as her own. Only once he was certain did he speak, and when he did, his tone carried no threat in it at all, only the flat confidence of a man stating a fact. He said the system as shown would overreact to short-term market swings. He said it would misallocate inventory at scale under exactly the wrong conditions. He said one small failure buried inside the design could cascade into something much larger, and that Mercer Access's biggest contract could fail within its very first quarter if the flaw wasn't addressed before launch.
Victoria went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with composure. The 3 problems Damon had just described in front of her advisors were the exact 3 problems her technical team had spent 3 months trying to bury, the ones she had been assured were under control. Helena Marlowe looked at Damon now with an expression that had shifted from discomfort into something closer to disbelief. Victoria recovered quickly, snapping back into the voice she used in boardrooms, and demanded that Rubin fire him on the spot, threatening to cancel every event contract Mercer Access held with the restaurant's parent company. Rubin refused, calmly explaining that Damon had only responded after being provoked, and later that night he quietly pulled the full security footage from the dining room camera and saved it, uncertain why he felt the need to do, only that he did. By the next morning, Victoria had already begun digging into the background of a waiter she'd never bothered to learn the name of, and what she found stopped her cold. Damon Price had been the founding architect of Crestline Systems, the very platform Mercer Access had acquired and quietly folded into the foundation of Horizon. His existence, she understood immediately, threatened everything she had built her name on: the story she told investors, the image of a progressive leader, and the legacy she had spent years constructing around a technology that was never entirely hers to claim. Damon understood, driving home to Brooklyn that night, that Victoria would not simply let the matter rest. He could stay silent, protect the ordinary life he had built for Mila, and let the humiliation fade the way so many others had. Or he could stand against a woman with money, media, and power on her side, and risk everything he had rebuilt since the day he signed away his company to save his daughter's life. He pulled into the small lot behind his building and sat behind the wheel for a moment, replaying the dinner in his head. Not the insults themselves, but the ease with which Victoria had delivered them, as if she'd rehearsed that particular cruelty on 100 other people who never had a diagram to catch her with. He thought of Renee, gone 3 years now, and how she used to tell him that dignity wasn't something you had to prove to a room, only something you refused to let a room take from you. He had believed her once. Tonight had tested that belief in a way nothing had since the hospital. Inside, Mila was already asleep on the couch with a half-finished math worksheet on her lap, and Damon carried her to bed the way he had 1,000 nights before, careful not to wake her, careful to keep his hands from shaking. He sat in the dark kitchen afterwards, turning the evening over slowly. He had spent 7 years building a life where no one asked about Crestline, where his name meant nothing to strangers, and that anonymity felt like safety rather than loss.
Victoria Mercer had just made that safety impossible to hold on to, whether he chose to fight her or not, because a woman like her did not forget the one person who had ever made her go quiet in front of a room full of people whose opinions she valued. I thought about calling Rubin, then decided against it, not out of distrust, but because he needed one night to sit with the decision alone before it became something other people had opinions about. Somewhere in that quiet, staring at the reflection of the stove light against the dark window, Damon understood that the version of himself who could simply return to work tomorrow and act as though nothing had happened no longer existed. Victoria had reached into a life he'd rebuilt piece by piece and found the one thread that could unravel it all. And now the only real question left was who would decide how the rest of the story got told. By the time Damon woke the next morning, the story had already outgrown the dining room where it started. A video clip had surfaced online, 11 seconds long, beginning at the exact moment he set the wine bottle down and spoke. Everything Victoria had said before that moment, every comment about her age, her daughter, her shoes, had been cut away, leaving only a black man in a waiter's uniform staring down a wealthy white woman and telling her to mock him again if she dared. The clip spread the way clips like that always spread, fast and without context, shared by people who had never sat at Table 9 and never would. Commentators who knew nothing about Astor House described Damon as an aggressive employee, a disgruntled former businessman looking for attention, a man exploiting racial tension to justify his own unprofessional behavior. News anchors repeated the framing without questioning it, and strangers online debated his tone of voice as if 11 seconds could ever hold an entire evening inside it.
Some accounts went further, digging up an old photograph of Damon from a Crestline conference years earlier and using it to suggest he had always been looking for a moment like this one, a chance to turn his own bitterness into a headline. Nobody asked what came before the clip began. Nobody seemed to want to. The version of events that traveled fastest was the one that required no context at all, just a man's face and a sentence stripped of everything that gave it meaning. And Damon watched it multiply across his phone that morning with a kind of numb disbelief, refreshing a feed he knew was only going to get worse the longer he looked at it. Victoria appeared in front of cameras that afternoon with the composed sorrow of someone who had rehearsed grief in a mirror. She said it was unfortunate that an ordinary service disagreement had been twisted into something about race, and she said she took no pleasure in seeing a working man's reputation suffer, but that businesses had an obligation to protect their customers from threatening behavior. She added, almost as an afterthought, that she had always believed deeply in equality and opportunity, and that comments suggesting otherwise misunderstood everything she stood for. In 4 sentences, she managed to make herself the injured party, erase everything Damon actually experienced, and turn a man who had stood perfectly still into someone the public should fear. Watching the clip later that day, Damon found himself almost impressed by how effortlessly she'd done it. The same steady voice she must have used 100 times in boardrooms, now aimed squarely at rewriting a story she herself had started. Reuben watched the interview from the back office at Astor House, arms crossed, jaw tight enough to ache. He had the full footage saved on a drive in his dresser drawer, unedited, every insult intact, and it took real effort not to release it himself that same hour. He didn't, not yet, because he understood something Victoria clearly didn't expect anyone around her to understand. Patience could be its own kind of weapon, and using it too early would only get it dismissed as one more angry employee taking sides against a client. He locked the drive back in his drawer and told himself the moment for it would come, even if he didn't yet know when. Around the restaurant, the mood shifted in ways Damon felt even before anyone said anything to him directly. A few co-workers offered quiet nods of support in the hallway, careful not to be seen doing it near management. Others avoided him entirely, unsure whether standing too close to the controversy might cost them their own shifts. Damon understood both reactions and blamed neither. He had spent years building relationships in that kitchen and dining room, and watching them strain under a story that wasn't even true reminded him how quickly a public narrative could rewrite years of private trust. The video reached Mila's school before Damon even had a chance to explain it to her in his own words. A classmate told her that her father had threatened a billionaire and might go to jail, repeating language he obviously heard from an adult at home who had watched the same news segment Victoria gave that afternoon. Another classmate asked if it was true that her family was poor and angry about it, a question that clearly came from beyond a 10-year-old's own imagination. Mila came home quiet in a way Damon worried more than tears would have, dropping her backpack by the door and standing in the kitchen without taking on her coat. "Did you really scare her?" she asked, and there was no accusation in it, only the flat confusion of a 10-year-old trying to reconcile the father she knew with the man described on a stranger's phone screen. Damon knelt down to her level the way he always did when something mattered enough to require his full attention, and told her the truth plainly. He hadn't threatened anyone. He had simply refused to let a woman use his daughter to make him feel small, and he wasn't sorry for that, whatever the internet decided to call it. "She asked me things about you first," Damon said, "before I ever said a word back to her. Nobody online is showing that part. But you know me, and I need you to trust what you know over what a stranger's video says." Mila believed him the way she always believed him, without needing anything more than the calm certainty in his voice. She asked one more question before heading to her room, quieter than the first. "Is it because we're not rich like her?" Damon told her it wasn't about money at all, though he understood exactly why a 10-year-old watching adults argue about a billionaire would land on that explanation first. He told her some people simply decided who mattered before they ever learned anything true about them, and that had nothing to do with what her family did or didn't have. Watching her carry her backpack back to her room that evening, Damon understood something had shifted permanently. Whatever happened next wasn't only about his own dignity anymore. It was about whether her daughter would grow up believing the world could be corrected with the truth, or whether she'd learn early that money and headlines simply decided who got believed. Helena Marlowe called 2 days later and asked to meet somewhere away from the office, somewhere quiet, away from anyone who reported to Victoria. She found Damon sitting on a bench outside a small park near his apartment, and before he could say anything, she apologized for her silence at the dinner, admitting she had understood exactly what was happening in real time and chosen the deal over speaking up. "I told myself the negotiation mattered more than staying quiet for one evening," she said. "That was a lie I needed to hear less than you needed to hear the truth." The park was mostly empty that afternoon, just a few joggers passing along the path, and Damon didn't soften the moment for her comfort. "You didn't stay quiet because you didn't understand what was happening. You stayed quiet because the contract mattered more to you than my dignity did, right up until it became inconvenient not to notice." Helena had no answer for that, and to her credit, she didn't try to manufacture one. She sat with the accusation instead of flinching from it, which told Damon more about her than any apology could have. Prejudice doesn't only live in the words of the person doing the insulting, it lives just as easily in the silence of people who know something is wrong and decide speaking up is too inconvenient. Helena absorbed that without argument, and something in her expression suggested she intended to carry it further than a single conversation on a park bench. She offered to testify publicly about what she'd witnessed, and she offered Damon a position at her own firm, something with real title and real security behind it. Damon turned the job down without hesitation, telling her plainly that she had only started to see his value the moment she learned he understood technology, and that wasn't the kind of respect he was interested in collecting. "I don't need a better version of what happened at that dinner, where you finally notice me once you find out I'm worth something on paper. I need people to see the value in a man carrying trays the same way they'd see it in a man carrying a title." Helena accepted the correction rather than defending herself against it, and from that point on, something between them shifted from guilt into something closer to genuine partnership. She began quietly reviewing internal Mercer Access records afterwards, starting with version histories tied to the Horizon platform, looking for anything that could confirm what Damon already knew to be true. What she found was suggestive but incomplete fragments of code repositories that hinted at an older origin without proving who had built it first. She needed something more specific, something only the platform's original architect could provide. That was when Damon told her for the first time out loud about the fingerprint he'd left behind in the original Crestline build 7 years earlier. Buried deep inside the forecasting module was a validation string, a small piece of test code he'd written the week Mila turned 3, named after a phrase she used constantly back then, back when she was still small enough to be learning full sentences and repeated the same 3 words every time something excited her. It was, he admitted to Helena, the same week he'd been signing away his company in that hospital conference room, and he'd written the string almost without thinking, needing something of hers close to the work even as he was preparing to let the work go. No public documentation described it. No outside engineer would ever think to look for it. Only the person who wrote it would know it existed at all. Helena used her access and her professional network to trace it, spending long nights after her official work hours combing through archived repositories that Mercer Access never expected anyone outside the company to examine closely. Within days, she had assembled a case far more solid than anything either of them had started with. Version histories carried Damon's name buried in early commit logs Mercer Access never bothered to scrub completely. Original design documents matched his description of the architecture down to the smallest detail, right down to the naming conventions he'd once used out of habit rather than any official standard. Internal emails showed engineers had flagged the very same 3 flaws Damon named at dinner. Months of exchanges where junior staff raised concerns that were quietly closed out by senior management without resolution. Other messages showed Victoria herself had received those warnings directly and continued publicly describing Horizon as her own singular achievement anyway, never once acknowledging the risks sitting in the very platform she was preparing to launch. Helena wanted to release everything immediately, certain the evidence spoke for itself and would end the controversy within a single news cycle.
Damon stopped her before she could, explaining that he had no interest in becoming a supporting character in what the public would inevitably frame as a fight between two powerful women, one story quietly erasing him a second time in the retelling of it. He agreed to move forward together, but only under conditions he set himself. Helena could verify and organize the evidence. He would be the one to tell his own story in his own words, and no one, however well-intentioned, would speak for him or turn his life into material for someone else's redemption arc. For the first time since the dinner, Damon felt something closer to control returning to his hands, not because the danger had passed, but because he had finally chosen to stop carrying it entirely alone. That fragile sense of control didn't survive the week. Victoria's communications team released a report to several financial outlets accusing Damon of abandoning Crestline during a critical growth period, framing his equity sale as a self-interested exit rather than a father's desperate choice. The report never mentioned a hospital, a heart defect, or a 3-year-old girl waiting on a surgical table. It painted him instead as a bitter former founder nursing resentment, someone now weaponizing accusations of discrimination to extract sympathy and leverage. Reporters who had never spoken to Damon quoted the report as though it were established fact, and within a day, the framing had hardened into the accepted version of events for anyone only skimming headlines. The report circulated quickly among the kind of readers who never bothered to check a second source, and within a day it had become the accepted shorthand version of Damon's story in certain circles, repeated in comment sections and dinner conversations by people who had never met either him or Victoria. Corporate clients who had booked events at Astor House began canceling within days, unwilling to be associated with a restaurant now tangled into a controversy involving a major tech executive. Rubin tried to absorb the financial hit himself, moving numbers around to protect his staff for as long as he could, but eventually he had no choice but to cut hours for co-workers who had nothing to do with any of it, people Damon had trained himself. People who now watched their paychecks shrink because of a dinner they hadn't even served. Rubin never once suggested Damon had done anything wrong, but Damon could see the toll settling into the restaurant regardless. Co-workers avoiding his eyes, not out of blame, but out of the discomfort of not knowing what to say to him anymore. He resigned before Rubin ever had to consider letting him go, walking into the back office one afternoon and setting his apron on the desk without ceremony. "You've done nothing but protect me," he told Rubin. "I won't let that cost you, the people who work here." Rubin argued for a moment out of loyalty, reminding Damon that he'd built this restaurant's reputation as much as anyone, but he understood, watching Damon's face, that the decision was already made, and that arguing further would only prolong an uncomfortable goodbye neither of them wanted. Rubin walked him to the door that last evening instead of letting him leave quietly through the kitchen, shaking his hand the way he might have shaken the hand of a business partner rather than an employee. "This isn't finished," Rubin told him. "Whatever happens next, you call me first." Damon nodded, unable to say much else without his voice catching, and stepped out into a Brooklyn evening that suddenly felt far less certain than it had a month earlier. The restaurant lights glowing behind him in a window he no longer had any reason to walk back through. The damage reached further than the restaurant. Damon had spent 3 years quietly saving toward a small restaurant of his own, a modest place he planned to call Price and Pine, and he'd finally found a landlord willing to rent him a storefront in Brooklyn. That agreement collapsed within a week, the landlord citing vague concerns about liability after reading the same articles circulating about Damon's past. 3 years of saving, 3 years of careful planning, evaporated over a single phone call. Damon never even got to be part of a voicemail left on his phone, citing unspecified concerns and wishing him luck elsewhere.
He listened to it twice in the empty apartment, sitting on the edge of his bed with Mila's laughter drifting in faintly from the next room, and found he couldn't summon the anger the moment probably deserved, only a tired kind of grief for a plan he'd carried carefully for 3 years. Helena offered to buy the property herself through an intermediary company and quietly lease it back to him, insulating him from any landlord's second thoughts about his name. Damon refused immediately, almost reflexively, telling her he had no interest in owing anyone anything, especially not something this large. Self-respect doesn't mean turning every offer of help into an insult, Helena told him, more directly than she'd spoken to him before. Damon answered that he simply didn't want to be indebted to anyone, and Helena pointed out, without cruelty but without softening it either, that his refusal to accept help from anyone was no longer only costing him. Mila was living inside of his isolation, too, along with Ruben and every coworker who had already lost income, defending a decision that wasn't fully theirs to defend. Damon didn't have an answer ready for that. He'd built his independence into something close to armor over the years, first out of pride, and later, if he was honest with himself, out of the memory of what it felt like to be used by people who claimed to be on his side, back when Crestline was still his. Somewhere underneath the principle, he recognized, was simply fear of being taken advantage of again, dressed up as strength. And Helena's words sat with him longer than he wanted to admit, following him home that evening and refusing to quiet down, even as he tried to focus on making Mila's dinner instead.
And he understood why some part of him had decided years ago that needing no one was safer than needing someone who might eventually walk away. But watching Mila set the table without being asked, quiet and careful in a way she hadn't been before all of this started, he began to wonder whether the version of strength he'd been protecting was actually costing her more than it was protecting either of them. The lowest point arrived without warning, the way the worst moments usually do. A journalist working for one of the outlets covering Victoria's version of events tracked down Mila's school, and someone led a reporter close enough to approach her directly in the schoolyard during recess. The reporter asked whether her father hated Victoria Mercer, whether Helena Marlowe was secretly paying him, whether their family was trying to extort Mercer access for money, whether they were using race as leverage to get what they wanted, firing the questions faster than a 10-year-old could process any single one of them. She tried to answer the first question, then the second, her voice growing smaller as the reporter kept pressing without giving her room to catch up. Mila panicked and ran, cutting across the sidewalk toward the street without checking for traffic the way Damon had taught her 100 times before. She didn't see the car until it was already braking hard, tires screeching against pavement just short of where she stood frozen. She wasn't hurt, not physically, but something in Damon broke completely the moment he got the call and arrived to find her shaking on the sidewalk, a stranger's hand still resting awkwardly on her shoulder, trying to keep her calm. He carried her home wrapped in his coat, her small body trembling against him the whole ride, and he sat beside her bed until she finally fell asleep, watching her breathing settle into something even and slow. He replayed the moment on the sidewalk over and over, the sound of the tires, the way she'd frozen instead of stepping back, and no amount of telling himself she was safe now made the image sit any easier in his chest. Only then did he go into the kitchen alone and make a decision that had nothing to do with fighting anymore. He pulled the folded blueprint for Price and Pine out of the closet, packed it into a box along with a handful of other belongings, and began preparing to leave the city entirely. If he simply disappeared, he told himself, Victoria would have no one left to attack, and Mila would finally be safe from strangers asking her questions she was never equipped to answer. Mila found him packing that box before she went to bed, and asked one question that stopped him cold. "If she's the one lying," she said, standing in the doorway in her pajamas, "why does she get to decide that we're the ones who have to leave?" Damon had no answer for her that night, and he let her go back to bed without one. The next morning, he found the blueprint sitting on top of the box, exactly where he'd left it, except now something was written across the back in his daughter's handwriting. "The place where Dad never bows to anyone
it read in careful 10-year-old letters that had clearly taken her several tries to get straight, some words crossed out and rewritten until she was satisfied with how they looked. Damon stood in the kitchen holding it for a long time, running his thumb over the crossed-out words where she'd clearly changed her mind about how to phrase it, and understanding finally that running might keep Mila safe for a while, but it would also teach her that people with enough power could win simply by lying loudly enough and long enough. He thought about Renee then and what she would have said watching him pack that box, and he suspected she would have asked him the same question their daughter just had. He called Helena that same morning, and then Ruben, admitting out loud for the first time that he could no longer manage this on his own, and the trying to had already cost more than he was willing to keep paying. Helena answered on the second ring, and when he told her he was ready, she didn't celebrate or rush him, only asked what he needed from her first. Ruben's response was simpler still, just a single line before he asked what time to meet. "Told you to call me first. Now tell me what you need." Damon agreed to accept their help, but he kept the same conditions he'd set from the start. Helena would verify and distribute whatever evidence they had gathered. Ruben would provide the full unedited footage he'd quietly saved from that first night. Damon himself would be the one to stand up and speak in his own words, without anyone softening or sharpening his story on his behalf. And no matter what happened next, the goal was never going to be revenge against Victoria Mercer. It was going to be the truth spoken plainly, and whatever accountability came after it. For the first time in weeks, Damon slept through the night without waking to check his phone, not because the danger had passed, but because he had finally let people who cared about his family carry part of the weight alongside him. He still didn't know how the story would end, only that he was no longer walking toward it alone, and that Mila, asleep down the hall, with the blueprint now tucked safely back in its box, wouldn't have to watch her father disappear to keep her safe. Mercer Access held the Horizon launch inside a glass ballroom filled with board members, international investors, financial press, and partners preparing to sign contracts worth more money than Damon had ever earned in his entire career combined. Victoria walked onto the stage that morning intending to call the platform the greatest achievement of her career, and for a few minutes, standing under lights designed to make her look untouchable, surrounded by applause she had grown used to expecting, she almost believed her own story again. Behind the scenes, the quiet machinery Damon had agreed to was already moving.
Helena had sent verified documents to several members of the board earlier that week, choosing each recipient carefully. People known for asking hard questions rather than simply following Victoria's lead. Damon's name had been placed on the guest list through a contact Helena trusted completely, someone who owed her a favor and asked no questions about why. Ruben had already transferred the full unedited footage to a handful of phones belonging to people inside that room, timing the transfers so they would arrive quietly rather than all at once. Some board members had begun asking quiet questions among themselves in the days before the launch, uncertain what to make of rumors that had started reaching them from more than one direction, unable to say exactly why they felt less confident about the morning ahead than they had a month earlier. Victoria noticed Damon's name on the list before the doors even opened, and she reacted the way she always reacted to anything threatening to slip outside her control. She revoked his access immediately, locked down the main presentation system, and ordered security to remove him the moment he appeared, telling her team flatly that no outside device would be permitted anywhere near the central screen that morning. When Damon walked through the entrance in a plain gray suit, security closed in within seconds, hands already reaching toward his arm. Victoria seized the moment, turning to the room and announcing that this man had threatened her once already and was now attempting to force his way into a private event. Several guests turned to look, uncertain whether to be alarmed or simply curious about the man causing such a visible reaction from someone usually so composed. Damon didn't raise his voice, and he didn't pull away from the hands gripping his arm. "Did you ever see me as an engineer before you knew my name?" he asked loud enough to carry across the room. Victoria said nothing, her expression flickering for just a moment before she caught herself and smoothed it back into something closer to composure.
When I wore a uniform, you decided I couldn't understand technology, Damon continued. When I pushed back against being insulted, you called me dangerous. When evidence proved I built this platform, you called me a bitter man looking for attention. He turned slightly toward the board members seated near the front. The problem was never that she didn't know who I was. The problem is she decided who I was allowed to be the moment she looked at me. Security began to move him toward the exit, but an investor near the front stood up, one of several who had already received Helena's documents earlier that week, and asked the room to let him finish. Another guest confirmed openly that the materials circulating did appear authentic, and a ripple of uncertainty passed through the crowd that Victoria could feel even from the stage. Damon began speaking from memory, calm and precise, naming the original module structure, describing how data moved through the system's core layers, explaining the reasoning behind design choices he had made years earlier when the platform was still just code on his own laptop. He described the same 3 flaws he'd named at dinner, and then, for the first time in public, he mentioned the small validation string buried inside the forecasting module, the one built around a phrase his daughter used to repeat when she was 3. A Mercer access engineer sitting near the back of the room straightened in his seat, recognizing every detail Damon described as accurate technical language no outsider could have faked convincingly. Victoria tried to regain control, and Damon had sold the company and surrendered every right to its technology the moment he signed those papers calling him a waiter, clinging to a past that no longer belonged to him, suggesting he was using accusations of prejudice simply to apply pressure. Damon let her finish without interrupting. Then he told the room plainly that he had signed the sale of his company inside a hospital conference room while his daughter waited 2 floors up for emergency heart surgery. I lost a company, I kept my daughter. If I had to choose again tomorrow, I'd sign those same papers without hesitation. Victoria answered coldly that nobody had come to hear a waiter's personal story, and the words landed wrong the instant they left her mouth, the room shifting almost visibly around her. Helena stood near the side of the ballroom and confirmed quietly that the documents had already reached the entire board. Reuben, watching from the back, sent the full unedited footage to phones throughout the room within seconds. Victoria could lock the main screen, but she couldn't lock every device in a room full of investors already reaching for their phones, and within minutes the footage was playing silently across dozens of small screens at once. Guests watched. Victoria refused to use Damon's name, watched her express open surprise that he could speak intelligently about business, watched her suggest he didn't belong inside rooms like this one, watched her bring his daughter into an insult meant only to wound him. A board member near the front called for the main screen to be unlocked, and after a tense moment, someone complied, letting the full footage play across the central display for everyone to see. The original design documents appeared next, projected beside the footage, and Damon turned to Victoria and asked her directly to explain the 3 structural flaws in a platform she had spent months calling her personal achievement. She reached for corporate language, vague phrases about risk tolerance and market responsiveness, but Damon pressed further into the specific mechanics, and she had no answer that held together under any real scrutiny. The Mercer access engineer stood then and confirmed in front of the entire room that Damon understood the platform's architecture better than anyone currently employed by the company, that Horizon was nowhere close to deployment, and that internal warnings about exactly these flaws had been raised and ignored months earlier.
Victoria said nothing after that. For the first time in her career, money, position, and assumption failed to decide who deserved to be believed in that room. The board suspended the Horizon launch before the morning ended, and Victoria was placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation into the platform's true origins, the removal of Damon's name from its development history, the suppression of internal engineering warnings, and the media campaign built on a heavily edited video.
News of the suspension broke within the hour, and this time the story carried far more context than the 11-second clip ever had, forcing outlets that had repeated Victoria's version of events weeks earlier to quietly walk it back. Mercer Access formally acknowledged Damon as the platform's original architect within days and offered him a substantial royalty agreement tied to its continued use. He turned down an offer to return as Chief Technology Officer, telling Helena privately that he had no interest in inheriting the empire Victoria had built on his work. Victoria lost her position as chief executive once the board confirmed she had known the technology's true origins and continued building her public reputation on a story she understood to be false. Nobody framed her downfall as a woman losing to a man, and Damon made a point of correcting anyone who suggested otherwise. She was held accountable for looking down on a person because of his race and his job, for erasing another man's work, and for using her power to turn the person she'd wronged into the one who appeared guilty. Mercer Access committed publicly to transparent crediting of employee contributions, a formal process for handling discrimination complaints, and a full review of hiring and promotion practices across the company. Damon told Helena quietly and only once over coffee a few weeks after the board's decision that policy changes were only ever a beginning, that real change would have to come from how people actually chose to see and treat one another day to day. Damon used part of his royalty agreement to set up a fund for Mila's future, and the rest to finally open the small storefront he'd once feared he'd lost for good. Price and Pine wasn't a grand restaurant. It had an open kitchen, a small table in the corner where Mila did her homework most evenings, a handwritten menu, and a staff that Damon made sure was treated fairly from the very first day. Above the staff station hung a single line painted simply on the wall: "No one who walks into this room is smaller than anyone else in it." Damon still worked the floor some evenings, greeting customers by name, the same way he always had, not because he needed the money anymore, but because he wanted Mila to understand that the work itself had never made him small. He greeted everyone the same way, whether they arrived in expensive coats or work uniforms of their own, whether they ordered the most expensive dish on the menu or asked quietly whether smaller portions cost less. And Mila watched all of it from her corner table, absorbing something her father had never needed to explain to her in words. One evening, setting the table together, Mila asked if Victoria was a bad person. Damon thought about it honestly before answering. "She did wrong things, and she had to answer for them," he said. "But hating her isn't the point. The point is that we don't become like her." Mila asked how to avoid that, and Damon told her it meant looking at people before their skin, their uniform, their money, or their title, and speaking up whenever someone else was being made to feel small, even when speaking up cost something. Victoria once believed power meant the ability to make other people go silent. Damon proved that real power was standing against injustice without letting anger turn him into the very thing he was fighting. Prejudice doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it lives quietly in assumptions, in glances, in the casual certainty of someone who has decided in advance who deserves to be heard. Fighting it was never about revenge. It was about bringing the truth into the light, demanding accountability, and building something better for whoever walked through the door next. If Damon's story moved you tonight, if it reminded you that quiet dignity can outlast even the loudest cruelty, do one small thing before you go. Hit subscribe and stay close for the next story, because there are so many more people out there who never bowed to anyone, and their stories deserve to be told too. Thank you for watching until the very end.